This week on the SaaSy Sales Podcast, we meet Dan Ussher, a really great guy with a great accent. He comes to us from New South Wales, Australia, where he runs two firms that he founded. One, GP Sales, is sales and technical operations outsourcing. The other one is FirmGuard, which is cyber security. Dan's got a really long career in enterprise sales. I don't think he'll mind me saying really long because it was pretty long. Started out doing some bid management work at Fuji Xerox and went on to do some really interesting things at companies like Salesforce.com. So this podcast for you if you're looking to chase the seven-figure deals. We answer questions like, when should we verticalize a go-to-market function? What are red flags in large deals? And what do enterprise reps have to get really good at? Let's get into it. So Dan Ussher, it's fantastic to have you with me today. Another good accent.
Thanks, mate. Matt, great to be here, and thanks very much for the introduction. Really appreciate it, and really welcome being here as part of the series for you.
No, it's great. So now, just for the folks listening around the world, where do we find you today? Where are you?
I'm sitting on a balcony in Bellevue Hills, Sydney, New South Wales. It's obviously working from home and enjoying the challenge that brings with us. But yeah, Sydney, Australia.
Fantastic. So I'm excited to chat to you because we've got a bit of shared history in terms of enterprise sales and whatnot.
We do.
Before we get into that, though, perhaps you could, I know you're involved in a couple of businesses, but perhaps you could share with folks what you're focused on right now, what your company does, and your role.
Absolutely. So founder and CEO of two companies. One is SalesGP, which we have spoken about, Matt, on a number of occasions. It's basically an outsourced sales and marketing leadership organisation where organisations with specific technical expertise who are looking to expand and accelerate their growth in region. And by in region, we're talking Australia, New Zealand, and Asia Pacific. Have specific technical requirements and or regional requirements here. Can launch their business and leverage our sales and marketing skills, expertise, and networks to accelerate their growth in the marketplace. Underpinning SalesGP is a company called FirmGuard, and FirmGuard is an information security, compliance, cyber strategy, and advisory service. We deliver compliance solutions to the marketplace, particularly within highly regulated industries such as financial services, and we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail later. So yeah, we're enjoying a really interesting time at the moment, and both businesses going well with full pipeline, and hopefully we'll see some interesting stuff come out of the next few weeks and months.
I'd love to hear that. Full pipelines are good pipelines. And so let's dig into that. So as I mentioned, you and I have a bit of a shared history with respect to a love, and perhaps both of us would claim a little bit of expertise on the enterprise sales side of things. And my journey really began back, I would say 98, when I was at Electronic Data Systems when we were doing large outsourcing deals. You, back in the day, used to be involved in very large bid management. And I was really keen to talk about that because it's not a topic that comes up very often in the North American SaaS world because, by comparison, SaaS transactions in the main are a lot smaller than those large enterprise deals. They do exist. Correct. There are enterprise groups out there, and I'd like to talk to them. But for those folks who aren't familiar with it, can you tell me what is a bid management group within one of these large companies like an Oracle? What does it do, and how does the sales organization interact with it?
It's a really good question, Matt. And I think in most respects, it is going to be different horses for courses, so to speak. And it's going to depend on the nature and the structure of your organisation in most respects. But for me, when we set up this division, in particular with Fuji Xerox, it was a very interesting process and initiative that was taken on by the CEO and sales and marketing leaders within the organisation at that time. We chose very specifically to focus on the sales organisation on the traditional side of the business, which was in most respects underperforming in a very, very challenging and diminishing marketplace. And I was brought on board to lead that process, lead the program, design the program in some respects as well, and deliver that through the organisation. The biggest challenge that we had was that the business itself didn't necessarily have a reporting structure to the sales organisation. So we had to manage as if we were in a matrix style organisation and lead as if we were in a matrix style organisation, and that we really had to educate and get the leadership teams bought into why we were involved and what we were doing to help them make their sales. And a big part of that was my role in ensuring that the sales and sales leadership understood straight away that we were not there to undermine the role that they played as the leader of the sale.
So Dan, can you help people understand, because many folks listening would have no idea what a bid management group even looks like. Like, what are the roles? What does it function? How is it measured? That'd be really helpful just to set some context.
Yeah, good idea. So in our particular scenario, we had content writers. Those content writers were specialists in understanding the sales organization, understanding the sales processes, and also the sales proposition and the unique proposition that you were offering to market. So they all had sales experience, but also very, very adept at being able to offer specific writing skills and capabilities in creating responses that were leveraging sales psychology and processes. So we were quite specific in the people that we wanted, and we were very lucky in that we had access to those kinds of people at that time. So having that sales psychology and training available to them was critical. So at an operational level, we had those content specialists. We had a bid manager or bid managers, as the case may have been, with strong leadership and project management skills around the organisation. And more importantly, technical specialists and solution architects who were able to work with the teams to understand the makeup of the solutions required. And I'll come back to that and what that means in terms of playing the tender game, if you like, or the bid game. And this is a really, really important differentiation that we made in the way that we operated, was understanding the psychology of why we do bids and what the customer at the end of the day is looking for. Of most importance for us was having strong leadership and buy-in from the CEO and the senior leadership team buy-in to the initiative. Each and every one of those leaders had deep understanding of the business landscape and the political structure and the industry to assist with navigation and executive leadership around the way in which we interacted with our customers and the target market. And I think one of the stranger initiatives that we had, or certainly very different ones that we had, was the implementation of what we called a senior business development manager. And their primary responsibility was to coach and actually lead the sales cycle within a bid. They led that sales cycle with the sales team and sales leaders, and they were the primary point of contact in the process of that bid with the customer. And that actually had enormous impact for the business in the way that we worked as a whole and as a team. And we took away some really, really interesting learnings from that, in particular around the way in which salespeople, particularly AEs, and our enterprise AEs, were able to interact with their customers and leverage the skills and expertise of the teams around them. And I started alluding to the fact before, Matt, that as human beings, we all behave in a manner we're rewarded. And I think it was very, very important that the remuneration comm structure of that BDM was very well thought through and reflected the values and cultures, and most importantly, the results that you wanted to achieve. So the BDM should not be seen to be eating into the salesperson or sales manager's targets or remuneration. Okay, so those were really important philosophies of what we put up in that. And overarching all of that was the autonomy and ability to have the final say on the bid. So, for example, are we actually going to bid? Is this a go, no-go situation?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the structure and control that a strong bid management process can put around deals. I know
Correct.
that we had a thing years ago called the Value Review Board, and it was basically when you put your flak jacket on and presented to the bid management leadership and other exec as to why we're going to go and invest in chasing this piece of business down.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
and to that end, clear and detailed processes, the qualification criteria, that is clearly understood by all stakeholders and agreed up front prior to even entering into the bid process. we also had very, very clear targets around what we were trying to achieve with the organisation. It was a new initiative for a very, very old school organisation, a very traditional style organisation. Each of those targets were very realistic, and they were very specific around having time-based initiatives attached to them. And for example, we had an appalling win rate of 1 to 13 that we knew of. And that win rate, that one that we were winning, were very low value clients that we didn't necessarily actually want to chase in the first place. So the decisions were being made at an individual sales rep perspective. We changed that philosophy overnight, and we put specific targets in place to move that ratio from 1 to 10 to 1 to 3 within 12 months and 1 to 2 within 24 months. We achieved 1 to 2 within 14, 15 months, depending on which measure you look at. But we were very clear around that, and with those targets, those processes and that qualification criteria, we were able to achieve that with the teams involved, and it was a celebration across the organisation.
It's unbelievable. And so, look, I think I would like to follow on from that. And given that you've seen dozens and dozens of enterprise deals, what are the specific muscles that an enterprise rep really needs to develop? If you have to think about the superpowers they need to have to be very effective for these, 7-figure plus transactions, what are they?
It's a really good question, Matt. And I think I'd like to attack that in two different personas here. And the personas I'll introduce to this will be the enterprise sales rep, okay, and that person who's ultimately responsible for the outcome of that deal. But also in this particular case, in the context of the question you're asking, is the involvement of the bid teams, BDM as well, and how that's actually worked from. I think both personas actually require very similar superpowers, and the ability to actually work together becomes critical to the success of that. Of most importance to me, and this was more a learning through the process than it was an immediate realization, was actually a very deep understanding of the political structure of the target client, i.e. who's really pulling the strings and influencing the outcomes. And what I mean by that is that, and I'll give you a specific example without naming the organisation. One of the most prominent financial services organisations and best brand names in the country had a tenure of over 125 years among 4 of their employees. Those 4 employees, none of which hold C-level roles, but certainly held the majority of influence when it came to the senior leadership team's influence and ability to make decisions and how sales were made within that organisation. If you did not understand that political structure of that particular client, there was no way you would be able to sell into them. So I think understanding that political structure is really critical. And it's something that we spend a lot of time on developing and understanding and working with the sales teams on how they actually put in place the right procedures and right work and activity to actually reflect that. The other one, and this is hard for sales reps because we're not wired like this, and it's that ability to know when to walk away. I think it comes with a bit of maturity and it comes with a bit of grey hair and experience, but knowing when to walk away is critical. If we don't have an involvement in a tender process, the chances of us actually having influenced that to the extent that we could win it are going to be virtually zero. I think the stats speak for themselves, and that we know and understand that 68% or more of the decision is made before they go to market or even start talking to vendors. Changes the way in which we sell, and it changes the way in which we make decisions. So, I mean, this may seem very simple, but it's a very, very hard thing to do, is the ability to know when to walk away. And I alluded to this before, was the ability to recognize the game and the psychology that is bid tendering and how to play it, i.e. knowing how to deliver a compliance solution. When asked for specific things, they're understanding the qualification, the evaluation criteria, and the weightings that are placed on each of those. So understanding the game that is played and the psychology behind the decision process that's being made is of critical importance. But do not be afraid of putting in a non-compliant bid. They're actually asking you to take leadership in this. They're not necessarily saying tick boxes. What they are asking for is, yes, comply. Help make our decision-making capability very easy. That game is not easy. and understanding the psychology behind that is hard. So I think in summary, those three main skills are probably the main ones that I would certainly be seeking to implore enterprise sales reps to understand. I think there's many more we can add to that, and again, it's it's a case by case basis. And I think also working within that matrix style organisation, i.e., you're not necessarily going to be working with people who report to you or have any line of responsibility or accountability to you apart from winning that deal. You've all got a common cause. Understand that common cause and what it is that you're doing. You're all on the same side trying to win that same deal.
Yeah,
I would agree. Question? Yeah,
I think that internal influence is something that a lot of people overlook as being critical to success, is it not?
It is.
Yeah. Changing gears for a second. You and I have a shared history at Salesforce.com, and you went into a vertical industry group, which is a very hot topic. So I spend a lot of time with founders or SVPs who are getting to the point where the business it's scaling. They have repeatability. And the question comes up around territories, specialization, verticalization, and whatnot. So my question to you is, what do you think are the inputs required to make a decision, or the context that makes it relevant for verticalizing your go-to-market function?
It's a really, really interesting question, Matt, and thank you for asking it. It's one that's very, very high on my agenda and very deeply interested in, and in some respects is the reasons how Sales GP as an organisation actually came to exist. And I'll start with the overarching comment. Just because we've done it overseas or in other markets, it does not necessarily make sense to do it here. And if you take that premise into asking your organisation or business unit as to why we are considering that verticalisation, then I think you've won half the battle, all right? And you've already made half of the decision. Your international markets, whether they be split up from a vertical perspective or split up in other ways, maybe geographical perspectives, do not necessarily lend themselves to other markets. And the cultures that exist in that from a business and personal perspective will drive your ability to verticalize. The other piece of that pie would be understanding what the total addressable market is. And do we have a market to sell into or an influence to sell into that market? Just because we think it's a good idea, does the market actually want it? So understanding that need from the market perspective, not from your perspective, is really critical. Now, there's a caveat to that, and I'll use the Salesforce days for that example. We had very, very strong industry verticalization throughout the States in a deeply regulated market that had been very, very successful. We decided to verticalize that financial services team in New Zealand, in Australia. And by doing so, we adopted very similar approaches and strategies in Australia. And it didn't work because we didn't understand the regulation obligations and the regulatory authorities' requirements to operate in a cloud computing environment within the Australian market. So we actually ended up doing a lot of lobbying with Microsoft and other providers in this market around, for example, data sovereignty. What did that mean, and what were the real risks attached to it? Is the government's position and organisational regulatory authorities' positions justified? Is it warranted? And we ended up doing a lot of education around that. But in tandem with that, we had a situation where we were still expecting to be able to sell into the market, which didn't necessarily work. So some of the considerations that you might like to think about as you're doing this is this your decision and your initiative to take it to market, or is this the market actually asking you to do so? You might want to think about staggering that entry to market. What I mean by that is take on industry experts, recognized industry experts into your business, and lobby the market, educate the market, help them understand why it's a good idea to take on a verticalized solution before you employ and put in place sales and marketing initiatives. And also localize that verticalized offering. Again, coming back to the same premise that I suggested right at the start, just because you've sold into other markets does not make you an expert in ours. And ours was a classic example of that within Australia. And that has been since overcome, but it's taken a long, long time for us to do that. We had the bandwidth, we had the capability, and we had the market capitalization to be able to support that over a period of time. Not many organizations have that scale and capability to be able to support an initiative and cushion that blow or the softness of sales through that period. That said, we did very well in other areas, so we had to pivot slightly. I think those are probably the main things, Matt. I'm happy to explore anything else in there that you think is probably worth talking about, and maybe you could share what the hot topics are.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, very helpful. I think what about for a very a venture-backed firm, which would be a lot smaller, that only exist in, say, the United States, and they've got geographic territories, and someone says, well, should we spin up a financial services vertical, or should we do a healthcare vertical? What are the decision-making input? What would make it make sense to do that, do you think? How could you summarize that?
I think the obvious one would be, do we actually have a solution that meets and or addresses a problem that's existing within that market? I mean, that's a fundamental solution. I would assume, for the purpose of this conversation, that you've already made that decision that, yes, we've got a solution, we want to target a specific market. Should we verticalize our offering in that space? Consideration in that would be, do I have expertise within my team to be able to deliver a story that is massaged and molded around that industry and the industry requirements? And I make that differentiation. What is it that the industry is actually asking for, as opposed to what we're thinking we should be selling into it? So again, do the research. If it's more general, then I wouldn't verticalize. If it's very deeply specific around solving a customer's problem or a particular industry's problem, then yes, verticalize. And if you've got that solution to do it. But I wouldn't take that on lightly. I think verticalizing does come with its risks, and it can isolate you as an organization and isolate individuals within an organization as well. The one caveat that I would put on top of that is that if you are going to verticalize, just because that's how we do it in, let's say, financial services, doesn't make it the right way. And we've seen an enormous pickup here in Australia around, let's take retail banking, looking at the retail sector as to how they should be looking at consumerizing their offering and actually getting closer to their customer. So don't just isolate yourself within that industry vertical expertise and knowledge of expertise. You're going to get more information and more benefit out of looking wider than you would by just looking within the industry and industry expertise. So in that, I mean, don't necessarily just look at the industry experts within that specific industry you're looking at verticalizing. Look outside it and look at the things that they're trying to achieve. So you might like to deploy a retail expert into the financial services space and look at the marketing initiatives and sales initiatives that they're taking in place and there to actually get closer to your customers in the banking sector. So those are the kinds of examples that I would certainly think about.
It's interesting. It's language I haven't heard from for a long time, where we talk about focusing on the customer's customer, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. No, great. Well, look, I know we're getting close on time, but there are a couple of questions I really wanted to dig into with you. You have taken the time to really educate yourself on diversity and inclusion. And we at SaaSy are about to form an advisory council around that. So it's definitely a topic near and dear to my heart. So what would be very helpful for our listeners, I think, is if you could just help us with some sort of practical and tactical tips that they should be thinking about to provide a safe, inclusive, diverse workplace.
Yeah, and congratulations, Matt, on taking this initiative. I think it's one generally needed across all industries. We've traditionally come from a very traditional industry in terms of diversity and inclusion, but in saying that, we've had some very, very strong leadership of late, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. On our site Salesforce, we've both been there, we both love it, and what they've done in implementing D&I strategies in there and across the industry has been fantastic. We've really led the way. It's also near and dear to my heart in setting up our organisation. We've been very clear on our policies and processes around this, but overarching all of that has been again, knowing where we sat both individually as people and where the organisation sat in terms of current climate, culture and readiness for a full D&I strategy. Don't bite off too much more than you can chew straight away. A simple reason is we have conscious and unconscious bias sitting within us. And it's really important to understand and be open and genuine and sincere about where that bias sits and what it's going to be looking like, where you personally sit as a leader, lead from the front, know where those gaps are and what needs to work. Lead with sincerity and honesty. Acknowledge those gaps, acknowledge the missing components of where you see the organisation fitting and what it should be doing. And it seems really obvious given the title, but include everyone on the process and seek out ideas on what's important to them when it all comes, when it all comes to D&I. What does it actually mean for the individuals and the organisation, and develop a culture around that from the start. We've personally gone out to understand that from an individual perspective. My business partner and I, we spent a lot of time on this. We have our own shortcomings and we're very open about that. But we've tried to lead from a position of authority on this in terms of putting in place practical and real examples of where we are taking the initiative. For example, we have sought to implement an intern program where we're targeting year 1 and 2 university students into our business. We have quite a niche requirement or a specialist requirement, but we've actually narrowed that even further in trying to attract younger generation into our business, and particularly targeting females into the industry. They think a lot differently than what we do as males, and that's an acknowledgement that we just have to take on. And it offers so much more benefit to us as an organisation in terms of who we work with and how we work with them, and the value that we're both bringing and all bringing to the table has been recognised, celebrated, and encouraged across the organisation. And that's just one very, very small example. I hope that's 3 or 4 very, very small tips. I don't think they're rocket science, Matt.
No, I think that's great. There's one thing that I learned through making a mess of it about a year and a half ago, actually, on the subject of D&I, is making sure that we bring people into the organization that share our values around that. And
Correct.
Where I messed up, and perhaps some folks might take some learning from, is that we hired a guy who kind of looked like me, mid to late 40s, great enterprise rep, referenced perfectly. And after 2 weeks of being inside the organization, we realized he was a complete chauvinist. And I was like, well, how do you stop that happening? And what we realized when we went back through the process is that we had no diversity in our reference checking. We didn't speak to any women in the reference checking. I mean, it sounds obvious when I say it out loud, but if you think back through your hiring processes, how often were we conscious of the diversity in the references?
And this is where I talk about that conscious and unconscious bias, and it may not have seemed obvious then, it does now, but it's those simple things that make such a difference in the way that we see and view people, and the way in which we put these processes in place. And look, it is a learning, it's a journey. We're not going to get it right from the start, and I think that's a really important acknowledgement to take into this. We as males, have worked in a very, very heavily male-dominated industry for a very, very long time. It's got to change. We play a role in that, and I think putting leaders in place that acknowledge that, and people in place around the whole organisation. We've had exactly the same problems, Matt, and so you're not alone. We had to dismiss someone earlier on this year for not aligning himself to those values of what the organisation, different issues, but similar kinds of things where we did not go through the process and the due diligence that we should have gone through, and we've learned a lot from that, and we've fixed up and tightened up those processes internally. About how we do that. So, look, you're not alone. We're all going to make mistakes, and I think acknowledging those mistakes and acknowledging that we don't lose from those mistakes, we learn, is a huge thing. And having that sincerity and humility to be able to front up to those mistakes with honesty and integrity is a big part of the culture we've tried to build as well.
That's fantastic. Well, I always like to finish on a very positive note and something perhaps a little more personal. Dan, you've had a really interesting and rich career. So I always like to know from folks, Do you have a personal philosophy or way of thinking about your professional journey that you might like to share with folks?
Look, I do, Matt, and I think it comes from a philosophy that I am better than no man and no man is better than me. And it's a cliched saying, but it's one that's often forgotten. And I've spent a lot of time in walking the floor, so to speak. I spend a lot of time in my day speaking to every single person within my organisation, and understanding what's driving them, what's keeping them up at night, what's worrying them, what are the issues that they're facing personally and professionally, and that I think has led me to be able to work with a very, very diverse range of people within my career, and also lead me to building a philosophy and a culture within the organisation that I'm now running that is going to see us well into the future and provide value to all of the people that are part of the organisation. From a sales perspective, I've always run my business like I own it. I'm ultimately in control of my own outcome and my success, and I think that has seen me through a lot of bloody tough times, as much as a lot of good success. And I do run my teams, virtual and otherwise, like a company. I'm deeply passionate about the role of every person in my organisation, understanding the role that everyone has, positive and negative, within the organisation, and embedding a culture of innovation and curiosity within the team. I'm naturally a curious person. I like to debate. I like to challenge, and creating that culture of earning that right to challenge has been something I've been really, really strong on. So, I'm not one to mince my words, but I'm also deeply respectful of earning the right to challenge. And that's something that I've also come in through as well. And having tough conversations is hard. You've got to earn that right. And I think if I can go back to one of the original questions you asked me about those superpowers, is an ability to actually have and know when to have those tough conversations is probably one of those other superpowers that I'd add to that.
Fantastic. Dan Ussher, really appreciated this. Thank you for giving this time, and all the best for the rest of the year.
Thank you, Matt. Much appreciated. And same to you and the team at SaaSy.